Welcome to Marginalia Radio. I'm your host, Art Remillard. Joining me is Matthew Stewart. He is author of several books on philosophy and history, including The Courtier and the Heretic, Leibniz, Spinoza, and the Fate of God in the Modern World. Today, Matthew is here to discuss his new book, Nature's God, The Heretical Origins of the American Republic, published by Norton in 2014. Matthew Stewart, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Well, let me just begin. Why did you want to write this book?
Well, that's just a good question about any book. I suppose any book is an act of optimism. I'll tell you what my optimism is. I take the view that we in America have the resources to build a more rational and ultimately more secular future. And I think that in that future we will probably be more spiritual and pious in some way, even as we're less religious in certain formal ways. And I think that when we get to this slightly better, though still imperfect future, we're going to need a new history. And that history, I think, will take us closer rather than farther from America's founding and the remarkable people who were involved in that. So I want to contribute to that sort of future history. And I want to encourage other people to participate in the project as well. So that's a kind of broad answer in terms of my hopeless optimism. Maybe I can give you a little more precise answer in terms of the theory behind what I think I'm doing, and then also some of the specific historical examples. As far as the theory is concerned, my basic interest is in the foundations of modern liberalism. We have these self-evident truths, equality, individual rights, consent of the governed, and so on, and I want to know where they come from. And if I may speak with a very broad brush, my feeling is that a lot of contemporary liberal theory doesn't really answer that question of the foundations of liberalism. It more or less just repeats the question by saying, well, these are the things we happen to believe in. It's cultural, or it's based on some sort of act of faith, or it's just what we happen to do around here, as Richard Rorty says. I think there is a deeper theory, a deeper explanation for how all of these pieces fit together. Part of the reason why I think that is, I think the concepts are there for us to use, but more than that, I think that it's there in the history. We can find a deeper foundation for liberalism in some of the very profound philosophy of especially the early modern period. So I wanted to get at that particular set of issues. And let me just say a little more about that theoretical foundation. I think this deeper theory comes at a certain price. In order to understand how the different pieces of liberalism fit together, you have to give up on certain very common, very human ideas about the way the world works, ideas about the nature of mind, the nature of ideas, also about where our values come from, and also where justice comes from. So in order to get at this radical theory underlying liberalism, you need to make that move. I think the early modern philosophers did it. And the American Revolution, I think, is interesting because it brings into the world this deeper philosophy, not necessarily on the basis of the intentions of all the people involved, but in a sort of collective way and not always in a conscious way. So within that project, the America's founders are very interesting, not because they necessarily understood everything that was going on or they articulated the deeper theory in a complete way, but because when you look at the mixed and contradictory basket of their concepts and ideas and passions and so on, you can piece together this deeper underlying theory. So that's my theoretical agenda, if I can put it in those grand terms. And then maybe I should just keep on going and tell you about some of the specific historical.
Well, sure. You mentioned the founders. I was going to ask you about one of the, you have the usual suspects in here, but then you have the name Thomas Young, which I don't know that most people are familiar with, but you deal with that pretty extensively.
Right. So here's this project began as I think any decent research project should begin, by just going back to some original sources and reading what's actually there instead of looking at summaries and so on. And so about 10 years ago, I started on that, and one of the first things I came across was Ethan Allen's Bible. It's this book called Reason, the Only Oracle of Man. It was written by Ethan Allen, the famous leader of the Green Mountain Boys, the hero of the assault on Fort Ticonderoga, and so on. Now, Ethan was this mountain man, completely self-taught, but mysteriously he wrote this 477-page book on philosophy. I read this book. I think I was one of the few people who had read it in the past century. And it's really interesting because it has a lot of very sophisticated philosophical arguments and tropes that come from the preceding history of philosophy. It's so sophisticated that historians later on couldn't reconcile the fact that this self-taught mountain man had written it. So they concocted this story that a man named Thomas Young had written it. I think this theory is completely untrue, has no foundation. In fact, although I believed it 10 years ago when I started on this project, in fact, I thought it would be a great detective story. So much for that. But I'm glad about the theory because it introduced me to Thomas Young. Now, Thomas Young is the great, in my mind, the great unsung hero of the American Revolution. I know we all have forgotten founders, but he's mine, and I'm going to stick with him. I just want to give you a sense of what he did and why it's really an outrage that he's been left behind in the history books. He was one of the first sons of liberty, and in 1765 he participated in the Stamp Act riots, which was the first act of colonial resistance. He then moved to Boston and became a leader in the radical faction there. He was probably the hardest worker on the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which was absolutely essential in disseminating democratic and revolutionary ideas throughout Massachusetts and then around the colonies. He was then the individual who first stood up in Boston town meeting and said we should throw the tea into the harbor. He was really, in a way, the militant leader of the Tea Party faction in 1773. He then shows up in Philadelphia, becomes best friends with Thomas Paine, leads the Pennsylvania Revolution, and is a co-author of the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, which was really the first modern constitution for a large democratic state. And it was sent over to France, and the French thought it was so wonderful that they wanted to emulate it. So he's a remarkable figure, but he's been left behind. And I'll tell you, one of the main reasons he's left behind is that this is a man who spoke his mind. So he was accused of various thought crimes, as it were, by the people in Boston as he rose to leadership. And it's interesting that his fellow members of the committee, some of whom were not at all accused of thought crimes, people like Sam Adamson, were passionate enough in his defense that they wrote these very moving letters that you can find in the bowels of the New York Public Library. And they go along the line, some lines like this. They say, well, Thomas Young is a remarkable individual. He has friends, many of them quite distinguished, everywhere he goes, despite the fact that he tells everybody exactly what he thinks on all matters, civil and religious and so on. It turns out that he was, in formal terms, a deist. That's what he called himself. In informal terms, they called him an infidel or an atheist. But what's interesting for me is that he left behind a kind of philosophical trail. He wrote in newspaper articles and in at least one anonymous pamphlet, he wrote down some of his basic philosophical convictions and doctrines. He also identified the sources that he relied upon. And it's there that I found a real richness, this side of America's philosophical heritage that I don't think has been adequately covered, that's much more interesting, much more sophisticated, much more international, and much more subversive than most of the usual stories allow. So just to wrap up on this whole Ethan Allen, Thomas Young episode, I don't by any means think that these two characters decided the American Revolution or they're the ones that were behind the whole thing. For me, they are canaries in the coal mine, or whatever the little indicators that things were happening in wider spheres that are intellectually extremely interesting. And so what I found was that many of these ideas that Young articulated quite clearly, you can find them, sometimes a little more disguised, but nonetheless there in the writings of our more famous founders, ones that end up in marble statues, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams and all of the rest of that cast of characters.
So you mentioned that he called himself a deist. Can you give us a sense of what the general perception of deism was, and then how significant that line of thinking ended up becoming for the broader revolutionary mind?
Yeah, so we like to think today, I think that deism is a simple term, and we identify it with a specific theological doctrine, the idea that the universe is created by some sort of machine maker deity who builds this amazing clock and then walks away to the sound of ticking noises. I think if you look at it in historical context, it's a much more complex term, and so you have to consider it in a variety of different sort of uses and applications. In, let's call it mainstream colonial culture at the time, as in mainstream English culture, to label someone a deist is mainly a term of abuse, and it's mainly a way of saying that they are not a Christian and they reject revealed religion. So when George Whitefield, the preacher of the Great Awakening, his great line is, I called someone a deist, I had almost said an atheist. When the English latitudinarians were giving their sermons and discourses against deism, they would title them things like The Folly of Atheism, or what is now called deism. George Berkeley, the same thing. So that's one context within which you can use the term. But then there's another one that people like Thomas Young consciously embrace, and that is to be a deist means to subscribe to a essentially rationalist philosophy that has a very long pedigree, almost all of that pedigree outside of the framework of the Christian religion, and that a kind of philosophical religion that perhaps ultimately reaches its sort of climax in a sort of divinity, a deification of nature. So it tends to regard nature itself as the source of whatever you call the divine.
One of the figures that you focus on in particular is Epicurus, and so how does he come into the story?
Well, one thing I would really like people to think about is the notion that the American project has very, very deep roots in the history of civilization. It's not just a fad that went through the North American colonies in the late 18th century, and it's not even just an expression of a certain movement that passed through the European world in the 18th century, what we sort of superficially call the Enlightenment. It has very deep roots. I think ancient Greece had a certain kind of enlightenment. I think that you look at their philosophy in a certain way, you'll see all of the main themes of the later Enlightenment prefigured in a certain way. And the fact that they didn't get a modern civilization, I believe, doesn't have to do with the ideas, but rather is more about the historical circumstances. Now, there are a number of other figures besides Epicurus that one could pick on to make this kind of point. I think that Socrates, Democritus, Parmenides would all be interesting candidates. Epicurus is particularly important because there's a link between Epicurus and the early modern philosophical revolution. That link boils down to Lucretius. So Lucretius captures some of the essential ideas of Epicurus, and then he brings them back in a sharp way to the early modern world. And this, I think, helps kick off a philosophical revolution that culminates in the American one. So that's the sort of name genealogy. And just to go into a few of the ideas, Epicurus is often summed up in terms of lifestyle. It's all about being happy, or I guess today we'd say something like pursuing your bliss. I see a kind of deep rationalism in his work. I think that he takes a certain guiding principle of philosophy and he ruthlessly works out the consequences. And the way he articulates this fundamental principle is just to say that nothing ever comes from nothing, or perhaps more precisely, nothing ever comes supernaturally out of anything. So that for everything in the world there is an explanation, everything follows patterns of cause and effect. And that applies even to the laws of nature themselves. So it's not just the case that everything follows a set of arbitrary rules, but rather all of the rules with which we use to explain the world themselves are subject to this kind of criterion of explicability. So I think that's the core principle, but then it also has a very specific manifestation in his cosmology. So he takes this principle, applies it to the universe as a whole, and he comes up with this really startling vision. He says the universe is infinite in extension, it's eternal in time, it has no center, it's everywhere composed of the same stuff, and our world is not unique. There must be other worlds out there. In the early modern world, that vision of the infinite universe gets recaptured by European culture. I think Giordano Bruno plays the key role there. He combines it with the Copernican theory and comes up with this equally startling vision that all the stars up there are in fact suns, they all have planets, and those planets are all inhabited. And then just to connect this back with our earlier discussion about Ethan Allen and Thomas Young, I guess one of the first thing that caught my attention, it's a small thing, but really mattered a lot to me, was to notice that extraterrestrials were a big part of Ethan Allen's world and of Thomas Young's world. And they were there in pretty much the same way, or with the same philosophical implications that you could find in the work of Bruno and before that in Epicurus.
Why supernatural beings, if you can elaborate on that?
Well, I'm saying that the Epicurean philosophy is essentially thoroughly naturalistic, right? And so there's no supernatural at all in the Epicurean worldview, and that complete rejection of any otherworldly explanation for anything within this world, that entirely immanent philosophical attitude in Epicurus, that gets carried through. I think that shows up in Bruno. I mean, Bruno says our nature is nothing but God and things, so he essentially collapses nature into God, or God into nature. And that, I think, is the grandest gesture of this early modern philosophy, that it essentially recognizes nothing outside of nature.
So with that in mind, then, the title of your book, Nature's God, right, obviously comes out of this era. What did this mean by the people saying it in the context in which they were in?
Well, so this phrase shows up most famously in the Declaration of Independence, of course, when we claim our independence in virtue of the laws of nature and of nature's God. And so it does show up in some very interesting other contexts. Thomas Young uses it, Benjamin Franklin does, and so on. In that declaration context, though, which is, I guess, where it really matters, a first point to note is it can mean a number of different things to different people. There certainly were many people who sort of read over it quickly and saw the word God and saw this as a kind of religious justification for American independence. And certainly if you're going to offer a kind of history of opinions or attitudes, that would have to count as one of the various attitudes that were in play. For people like Jefferson, I don't think it meant that at all. It was, in fact, the reverse. It was essentially a rejection that there was any kind of supernatural involvement in politics at all, and a claim that this republic was to be based on laws that are available to us through reason, evidence, and experience, laws that are essentially laws of nature in a physical sense as opposed to a deontological sense. So that, I think, is what it meant for people like Jefferson and so on. What it means for me and interpreters later on, I think, is even more interesting in some ways, because this philosophy of nature's God turns out to be very deeply connected with the underlying liberal theory that appears in the next few sentences of the Declaration of Independence and in other contexts. So it turns out that if you trace the genealogy of nature's God, or trace the genealogy of the space aliens, or these other kind of grand quasi-theological concepts, you find the same underlying radical philosophical structure that gives you the basic ideas of modern liberalism. You find the structure that gives you the equal creation of human beings, that gives you the notion that there are some unalienable rights, and then the idea that democracy is in some way the only legitimate form of government. So that's what I think makes it interesting for us looking back, is that this radical philosophical background turns out to be, at first it looks like just some sort of strange theological doctrine that appears in the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence, but in fact it turns out to be very deeply connected with the other very important claims that come later that in turn serve to structure the American world to some very limited degree at that time, but that have continued to structure our world in a very important way.
That's interesting, because you do go piece by piece, self-evident truths, pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal, these key phrases in here that you locate as originating from this radical philosophy. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I mean, and again, I'm interested in the theory, like how are these things connected conceptually? I mean, how is the pursuit of happiness connected to consent to the government and individual rights? But what's useful is also to know that you can find those connections in history. When you go through the preceding history of ideas, we can see the connections being made. In some ways, these philosophers of the early, of the 17th century and 18th century were quite remarkable, because they had to forge this set of ideas for governing a modern world without actually having such a world to fall back on. So for us, it's pretty straightforward. We can do it kind of unreflectively, just to say, well, of course we should have individual rights and be equal, because it kind of works, and everything's really well ordered, and don't want to go back to some kind of feudal system. I mean, this seems pretty straightforward. We just base that on the most simple observation and experience. They had to do it the other way around. They had to actually work on the ideas first. They were trying to explain a world that was sort of emerging around them. And so I think you can find these concepts being developed. Some of the suspects are the usual ones. So I think that John Locke, for example, is an absolutely central figure in understanding American philosophy. He's the one who really matters most for people like Jefferson. Some of them are less well known, but also matter in a very direct way. So Locke you can read a number of ways. It turns out that the Locke that matters is the one that you can read through an English philosopher like Lord Bolingbroke or the third Earl of Shaftesbury. So these are figures who are sort of known, but perhaps not studied as much as I think they should be. But then there are also some sources that are left out of the current tradition, but that I think should be resurrected and made the object of more serious study by those who are interested in philosophical origins of the American Republic and of modernity. So as I said, in the case of John Locke, who really matters a lot, there are different ways to read him, and let's just say there's a radical way and a moderate way. I contend that for people like Jefferson, it's the radical side of Locke that matters, although on biographical grounds, one could always argue that Locke himself was a very nice boy and a moderate. But the interesting point is that this radical Locke, I think, serves mainly to transmit ideas that came out of the Dutch Enlightenment, and in particular from Spinoza. So if you want to look for the sort of core structure that links together the pursuit of happiness with natural equality of human beings and the rest of the piece of the puzzle, you basically need to read back through Locke to find his inner Spinozist, and then that will get you a long way to understanding how the pieces fit together.
I want to end by going back to where you started with your optimism, and I guess I just want to ask a general question about where we are today in our discussion of the founding, and what do you think is just we're getting absolutely wrong, and how would you like to change that discussion moving forward?
Okay, so that's a lot to cover in whatever 30 seconds we have. I think you will have picked up that I'm not big on the Christian nation myth, and in fact, let me just say that I think it's something more than just another possible interpretation of the context. I think the Christian nation myth that is arguing that the United States, the American Republic, is somehow grounded on something that's essentially Christian amounts to a kind of betrayal of the revolutionary project. So I think I would like to see us move away from that. Another thing that I'd like to be understood is that the American Revolution was just a partial achievement. In fact, it was really quite slim. If you understand it in terms of its grandest theoretical ambitions, it opened the door to self-governance in human affairs, but it didn't bring us into the room by any stretch. And then more specifically, I think that if we imagine that what was established then was a democracy in the fullest sense of the term, then we are seriously deluding ourselves. We just opened up the possibility for rational self-government and a true democracy, but we have to keep working in order to try to realize that. And then maybe the last thing which sort of follows from that is that I just want everyone to be a little more patient. I don't think 200 years is such a long time. I think that we've been subject to a tremendous number of pathological responses to modernity. Often our history is driven by reactive movements that cut very much against the grain of the revolution, and this will undoubtedly continue for a long time. But even so, without supposing that there's some grand teleology at work or buying into some dreadedly Whiggish notion of progress, I think we should accept there is some hope for improvement, and that we can make the world a slightly more rational place, because we know that in the past, through philosophy, this has already happened, at least to some degree. So that's the optimism with which I began. I'm going to close with that. If that's okay with you?
That is optimistic notes are the best way to close. So that's where we're going to.
Okay.
And again, the book is Nature's God: The Heretical Origins of the American Republic. Thank you to Matthew Stewart for joining us, and thank you for listening. Have a great day.